Morning. David, it's the police.
David, you're under arrest on suspicion of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce in 1987.
Imagine a shocking story that even the mainstream media wouldn't show you. Meet David Fuller, a hospital worker in Kent, England. In 1987, he committed terrible crimes and took several innocent lives, but his violence didn't stop there.
In 2019, we had a breakthrough.
Bingo.
That person was David Fuller.
He would actually women whilst externally and internally.
From 2008 to 2020, he assaulted the bodies of women in hospital morgues. This video reveals his hidden and chilling crimes that will leave you speechless. Watch to uncover the dark secrets hidden in morgues that not even traditional media have dared to show. David Fuller and the nature of his crimes. David Fuller is often referred to as the morgue monster, who led a double life for more than 30 years, hiding behind the appearance of an ordinary man while committing some of the most heinous crimes in British history. Now in his 60s, he seemed like a typical family man, living a quiet life in an area of Heathfield, East Sussex, where he worked as an electrician in hospitals in both Kent and Sussex. To his neighbors and colleagues, he was just another person in the community. However, the shocking truth of his actions remained hidden for decades. Beneath his ordinary facade, Fuller was a killer and had secretly been desecrating the bodies of deceased women and girls. Born in 1954, his life was marked with a series of complexity. He was married 3 times, and his third marriage seemed to be stable on the surface, yet behind closed doors he was hiding a dark secret. In addition, he had several extramarital affairs. One of his long-term was with a nurse that he had met at work. She had recently shared her experiences, recalling how she met Fuller at the age of 27. They had cocktails together at a social club and then went to a concert. Fuller's outwardly normal life included hobbies like birdwatching, cycling, and photography, interests that would help him to blend into society and make it difficult for anyone to suspect his sinister activity. But his life took a dark turn in 1987 when he became the main suspect in the infamous bedsit murder. In that crime, 25-year-old Wendy Nell and 20-year-old Caroline Pierce were assaulted and murdered in separate incidents at their homes. These brutal crimes terrified the community and left them in fear. Adding to the strangeness of his life, Fuller had a connection to the London rock band Cutting Crew. In 1985, he worked as an unofficial photographer for the band and traveled with them on tour. This involvement with his other hobbies helped him to maintain an appearance of respectability. And despite his seemingly ordinary life, he kept his dark side hidden for years. The discovery of his crimes revealed a horrifying reality. Because of his job as an electrician, he had access to mortuaries, where he used that to commit unthinkable actions on the bodies of deceased women and girls. He was careful in his actions, allowing his crimes to go unnoticed for quite a long time. He chose his victims from the places where he worked, abusing his position to satisfy his depraved desires. The extent and nature of his offenses were both shocking and tragic, deeply affecting the families of his victims. People who knew him were completely stunned when they learned the truth. Family, friends, and colleagues had seen him as a normal and dependable man, but the stark difference between his public persona and private actions left everyone struggling to understand how he could be capable of such things. The revelation of his crimes felt like a profound betrayal to everyone who trusted and respected him. Historical crimes. In 1987, Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce were young women in their 20s, each beginning their own lives. They didn't know each other, but they both shared similarities in their jobs and friends. Wendy had just moved to a bedsit after her marriage had ended, and according to friends, the breakup was hard on Wendy, who was independent, hardworking, and wanted a family. She worked at a photo shop called Super Snaps, and on the night of June 22nd, her boyfriend dropped her off at home, and the next day her naked body would be found covered in blood. She had been beaten and assaulted, and neighbors had heard nothing through the thin walls. Caroline Pierce was 20 and worked at Buster Brown's, a popular restaurant, and the night that she disappeared, people could hear screams near her home. 3 weeks later, her body was discovered 40 miles away in a drainage ditch on some farmland. She was naked except for her tights, and a tractor driver discovered her body by chance. Her injuries were similar to Wendy's, leading detectives to believe the two cases, known as the bedsit assassin, were connected. In the 1980s, there were no mobile phones or CCTV, and DNA analysis was in its infancy. Detectives had limited forensic evidence, a bloody fingerprint on a shopping bag, and a footprint on a white blouse from Wendy's flat. In 1999, hopes of solving the case were dashed when the DNA sample didn't match anyone in the brand new database. Despite 2 appeals, the case went cold. Then in 2007, veteran detective Dave Stevens said the inquiry was scaled down but never closed. And in 2019, new forensic techniques allowed experts to collect DNA from a damaged sperm sample on Carolyn's tights. They used a method called familial DNA, which helps to identify if someone is related to the person whose DNA is found at the crime scene. The technique would be crucial, according to former Metropolitan Police Detective Noel McHugh, who advised Kent investigators and now works for the National Crime Agency. Without a familial DNA match, the killer's identity would have remained unknown unless he'd been arrested for another crime and his DNA added to the database. Familial DNA reduced the 6.5 million profiles in the database to a manageable number, eventually identifying the killer. Officers then looked at who had lived in the area during the time and was the right age, creating a list of possible suspects while ranking by likelihood. The closest partial DNA match was from a relative known as David Fuller. Police examined the family tree and focused on one. On December the 3rd of 2020, they went to Fuller's home in a quiet estate which had noticeable CCTV cameras, and when questioned, Fuller denied any involvement in the crimes. However, the detectives knew that it was a lie, and evidence was about to prove it. Fuller's palm print would match the one found in Wendy's flat, and his fingerprints partially matched the bloody print on the shopping bag. The case against him became overwhelming when a DNA sample matched the DNA sample of the semen found on Carolyn's tights from decades earlier, and it was discovered that he had lived on the same road as Wendy in the 1970s and 80s before she moved in. The investigation into David Fuller's actions would not be complete. In fact, it was about to reveal even more disturbing facts. When experts searched his home, they found a massive collection of computer equipment, which included hundreds of hard drives, memory cards, and over 2,000 outdated storage disks dating back to the 80s. Alongside those, he had 30 mobile phones and numerous SIM cards. They discovered a hidden compartment inside a cupboard where a cabinet had been fixed to the back wall, and inside there were 4 hard drives. They contained videos that Fuller had secretly recorded inside hospital mortuaries. As detectives watched the videos, they made a horrifying discovery. David Fuller had been abusing the bodies of deceased women. Noel McHugh, a key figure in the investigation, vividly recalled the day he read the shocking development in the report, saying that he found it hard to believe and that his thoughts immediately turned to the families of the victims who had been waiting for justice for 33 years. Fuller had worked at hospitals where he had a special swipe card, which allowed him to access all areas, including the morgue. And at one hospital, refrigerators used to store bodies had doors on each end. One end was monitored by CCTV cameras, but at the other, where the post-mortem examinations were conducted, there were no cameras at all. Fuller appeared to be aware of this and took advantage of the lack of surveillance, being no footage from the hospital capturing his vile actions, but the videos he filmed himself on a small camera became incriminating. Investigators could pause the videos and read the details on the patient's wristbands. They cross-referenced the metadata, which indicated when they had been filmed, with the names of patients in the mortuary at the time. And Fuller even kept a small black book containing the names of his victims. It became one of the worst cases of its kind anywhere in the world, with the police able to identify around 100 victims whose ages ranged from under 18 to over 85. Fuller had one of the largest collections of adult images and inappropriate pictures of children ever discovered by the police, and people who worked with Fuller described him as a friendly and helpful person. NHS sources mentioned that he was seen as the guy who could fix things, like light bulbs or electrical fuses with a smile, and experts would conclude that his crimes followed a distinct pattern. His mental health issues were linked to sadomasochism, and he dealt with his own problems through manipulative and harmful behavior. It was suggested that Fuller's crimes began with voyeurism, spying on people without their knowledge, and then gradually escalated to murder. Experts saw a direct connection between the deaths of Wendy Nell and Carolyn Pierce, along with Fuller's later offenses in the morgue, and these crimes were considered psychologically more extreme. Ironically, the crime of abusing dead bodies carries a maximum sentence of only 2 years, compared to life imprisonment for taking someone's life. That led to suggestions that the government needed to reconsider and possibly change the laws. Fuller was known to have abused the deceased between 2008 and 2020, but there's a significant gap in his record from 87 to 2008. That would lead police into looking into records of missing people to see if he could have committed other crimes during that period. The legal proceedings. In 2020, David Fuller was finally arrested for perpetrating the deaths of Wendy Nell and Carolyn Pierce. In January of 21, he pleaded not guilty to the mortuary crimes. However, in October of that year, he changed his plea to guilty. Just 2 days later, he admitted to the 2 killings, and on December 15th of 2021, the judge would sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of release and gave him an additional 12 years for the abusive crimes. At sentencing, the judge remarked that Fuller's actions had caused immense pain, not only to the families and friends of his victims, but also to many others who now had to live in fear that their loved ones may have been mistreated by him. She mentioned that the victims' families were tormented by his actions and left with a sense of nausea and heartbreak. They felt guilty for not being able to protect their deceased relatives and were mentally scarred for the knowledge of what had happened to them. The judge said that Fuller's actions shattered their trust and respect and decency with which the deceased were supposed to be treated. In November of 2021, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care announced in the House of Commons that an independent inquiry would be launched to look into how David Fuller was able to carry out such abuse in the NHS Trust hospitals, and the inquiry would also explore what lessons could be learned to prevent such a thing from happening in the future. A formal independent inquiry was done on January the 18th of 2022, but the families of the victims quickly pointed out several issues about how it was being handled. Not all of the families had received draft terms of reference, and those who did got different deadlines for their response. They were also sent complicated legal documents without explanation on how to understand them. It had not properly involved the family's legal representatives and refused to meet with them. It also had not confirmed whether it would consider comments from representatives on the draft terms, and additionally, the decision to hold the hearings in private led to suspicions that it was done to hide witnesses from public scrutiny, making it seem like a cover-up. In early December of 21, families publicly complained about the lack of communication from the inquiry. Amanda Mia, whose mother's body was assaulted by Fuller in 2018, filed a judicial review against the non-statutory nature of the inquiry. She represented several families who were dissatisfied with the government and the inquiry's actions. And the families argued that the inquiry didn't have the power to force people to provide evidence or attend as witnesses, unlike a statutory inquiry. They were worried that without those powers, important evidence would not come to light, witnesses would avoid giving testimony if they thought they could be blamed. Additionally, families couldn't apply for participant status, which would have allowed them to be more involved in the inquiry and have legal representation. They didn't receive funding for their legal costs and were concerned that the inquiry wasn't truly independent because those involved had been with the NHS Trust's internal investigation before and had connections to the trusts under investigation. On February the 7th of 2022, the judicial review proceedings were filed in the High Court of England, and solicitors representing 30 families released statements calling David Fuller's actions horrifying and deeply damaging to families involved. They criticized the lack of proper oversight, which allowed Fuller to commit the crimes over such a long period, arguing that only a thorough and judge-led statutory inquiry with public hearings could ensure justice while restoring public trust in how deceased bodies are treated in hospital morgues and other settings. They believed it was necessary to start healing the damage done by the victims' families and regain public confidence in respect for deceased bodies. Psychological impact on families of Fuller's mortuary victims and subsequent legal action. Lawyers mentioned that many family members of the people whose bodies were abused by Fuller had experienced mental distress on finding out about the mistreatment of their deceased loved ones. They pursued claims against the NHS Trust for breaching Article 3, torture and degrading treatment, and Article 8, the right to private life, of the Human Rights Act of 1998. Solicitors noted that the trust had agreed to set up a voluntary compensation scheme, clarifying that they didn't acknowledge any legal responsibility to pay damages to the close family members of Fuller's deceased victims. Nonetheless, the trust recognized that these family members had reasonable claims under the Human Rights Act of 1998, and the compensation was intended to address the claims. Azra Kamal was one of Fuller's victims who had died after falling from a motorway bridge in July of 2020. Her body was taken to a morgue where Fuller worked, and when her mother learned of the horrific crimes that Fuller had committed, she described how she felt an overwhelming rage, immediately grabbing a knife from her kitchen and heading to the police station believing that Fuller was there. She expressed that her only thought was that he should never escape punishment for what he had done to her daughter. She felt the need to take matters into her own hands and was deeply hurt by the news her daughter had been violated after death. She believed that if she had found Fuller, she was almost certain that she would use the knife on him. As she approached the police station, the situation escalated. Officers who had been informed that she was carrying a knife appeared and restrained her, taking her to the ground. They were not aware of her circumstances and thought she may need psychiatric help. Despite attempts to explain her daughter had been abused in the hospital while dead, they placed her under arrest. She would be held for 34 hours, and in their protocol, the trust acknowledged that Fuller's actions had caused emotional distress and possibly psychiatric injury to the family members of the deceased. They expressed a desire to compensate the families without admitting legal liability, aiming to provide relief without involving third parties. It was estimated that the average compensation claim would be around 25,000 to 30,000 British pounds, although some could reach six figures. Experts criticized Fuller that he was able to commit his crimes on NHS property for such a long period. They highlighted that the families already grieving their loved ones had to endure additional trauma upon learning that their relatives' bodies had been abused, and expressed satisfaction that the compensation scheme had acknowledged the need for payments to families, including provisions for psychological treatment if necessary. The NHS Trust then made a statement expressing relief that compensation had been approved by the Department of Health and Social Care and thanked the families for their contributions to designing the scheme, apologizing for the pain that Fuller's crimes had caused. The Trust recognized that no compensation would lessen the family suffering, but hoped that it would provide a fair and swift resolution, along with additional support for the families. Failures in hospital oversight. In a tragic and deeply unsettling turn of events, the closure of Kent and Sussex Hospital led to a series of revelations about its successor. The independent investigation brought to light severe criticism, and the inquiry revealed significant shortcomings which allowed Fuller to commit his crimes over a period of more than 15 years. It pointed out missed opportunities to question Fuller's work practices and highlighted a lack of attention to who had access to the morgue. Despite senior management being aware of the issue since 2008, few effective actions were ever taken, and the findings led to 17 recommendations aimed at preventing future crimes against the deceased. These included the installation of CCTV cameras and ensured that staff not belonging to the morgue were always accompanied by someone else. Hospitals have since been compelled to implement significant changes in their practices to prevent future incidents of this nature, and Fuller's actions show that there's still much work to be done to protect the most vulnerable among us, even as we progress in society. The case of David Fuller underscores a critical and deeply disturbing reality: the need for heightened security and vigilance to prevent egregious crimes. Fuller exploited his position of trust to commit heinous actions of assault on deceased individuals in hospital morgues, and his crimes, which went undetected for years, highlight severe lapses in oversight and security protocols. They emphasize the urgent necessity for systemic changes in how we safeguard vulnerable environments. But one of the most important lessons is the paramount importance of robust security measures in every institution, particularly those that manage sensitive and vulnerable situations. Hospitals are traditionally seen as sanctuaries of healing and care. They have to not only focus on the well-being of the living, but uphold the dignity of the deceased as well. Comprehensive background checks, continuous monitoring, and stringent access controls are all essential in assuring that individuals with access to sensitive areas are both trustworthy and accountable. Regular audits and evaluations of security protocols can help in identifying potential risks while reinforcing safeguards against internal threats. The case also illuminates the critical need for fostering a culture of vigilance within organizations, and employees at every level should be encouraged and empowered to report suspicious activity and behavior without the fear of retribution. This can be achieved through the implementation of anonymous reporting systems and the provision of training programs that educate staff on recognizing and responding to potential threats. Such an environment not only helps in early detection, but also fosters a collective responsibility towards safeguarding the organization and its stakeholders. The human element, however, remains central to the effectiveness of a security strategy. Training and development programs should not only focus on technical skills, but also on ethical standards and the emotional well-being of staff. Ensuring that employees are well supported and mentally healthy can reduce the likelihood of internal threats and enhance overall organizational security. Additionally, fostering an ethical work environment where integrity and accountability are valued can significantly reduce the risk of misconduct and criminal activity. The case of David Fuller calls for a reevaluation of how the dead are handled. It's imperative that institutions managing the deceased maintain the highest standards of dignity and care, and the implementation of specialized training for personnel handling sensitive tasks, coupled with rigorous oversight mechanisms, will help to ensure that the deceased are treated with the utmost respect and that their rights are protected even after death.